Hi there. Caught me while I'm on hold with a barber shop. Ah, leap day. The extra day we get at the end of February every 4 years to catch up on all those unreplied emails, unfinished crocheted sweaters, and unread novels on our nightstands. Let's face it, it's just another day to watch Outlander for the 4th time and slip slowly into madness. So, why is leap day a thing? Well, avid livers of life will notice that you've got a birthday every year, and if you're really jonesing for some birthday cake, you'll painfully count down each of the 365 days of the year until your next birthday. The problem is, our universe doesn't give in to our human demands of perfect scheduling. So rather than the Earth taking 365 days to orbit the sun, it actually takes about 365.25 days, or more specifically, 365.24219 days to circle the sun. That's a solar year, which means our calendar is off by a quarter of a day per year, which adds up over time. But don't worry, kids. Old Julius Caesar, way back in 45 BCE, added an extra day to the calendar every 4 years to make up for this discrepancy.
This is a leap day miracle!
Between that and his delicious salad, it's no wonder he went down in history as one of the greats.
Merry leap day, everybody! Hey, take a leap, pal! That's the spirit!
In honor of Leap Day 2024, we're going to take a look at a story that also deals with the wonkiness of time. Here, Constant Watchers, is Stephen King's science fiction horror teleportation tale, The Jaunt. The Jaunt made its first appearance in the Twilight Zone magazine in 1981, and soon thereafter was included in Stephen King's 1985 short story collection, Skeleton Crew. Before its initial publication in Twilight Zone, King sent the story to Omni magazine, where it passed editorial director Ben Bova's desk. As King recounts in the notes at the end of Skeleton Crew, his sci-fi story was initially much heavier on the fi and less so on the sci.
This was originally for Omni, which quite rightly rejected it because the science is so wonky. It was Ben Bova's idea to have the colonists in the story mining for water, and I have incorporated that in this version.
The Jaunt is set in the early 24th century when teleportation, also known as jaunting, is as common as hopping on a plane from Timbuktu to Portland, Maine, or Portland, Oregon for that matter. And King makes no bones about where he got the term, from Alfred Bester's 1956 science fiction novel, The Stars, My Destination, about, you guessed it, human teleportation. In The Jaunt, our protagonist Mark Oates and his family are preparing to jaunt to Mars for a 2-year business trip, and Mark regales his wife Marilis and his 2 children, 12-year-old Ricky and 9-year-old Patricia, about the discovery of jaunting by a scientist named Victor Carroon. Of course you know that the jaunt is teleportation, no more or less, he said. Sometimes in college chemistry and physics they call it the Carroon process, but it's really teleportation, and it was Carroon himself, if you can believe the stories, who named it the Jaunt. He was a science fiction reader, and there's a story by a man named Alfred Bester, The Stars, My Destination it's called, and this fellow Bester made up the word jaunt for teleportation in it. Except in his book, you could jaunt just by thinking about it, and we can't really do that. In telling both the story of the Oates family's jaunt to Mars and the story of Victor Carroon's discovery of jaunting, Stephen King uses the narrative device of what's called a frame story, or an embedded narrative. In other words, a story within a story. This is a device wherein a character becomes the narrator of a second story. Movies like The Sandlot, A Christmas Story, and Goodfellas use this method to great effect. And when boiled down to their essence, frame stories are basically bedtime stories. In fact, one of the most effective uses of this device is The Princess Bride, directed by Rob Reiner, who directed 2 Stephen King film adaptations, Stand By Me and Misery. In The Princess Bride, Columbo's Peter Falk reads his grandson, played by Fred Savage, a bedtime story, bringing us in and out of the fantasy story of the titular Princess Bride.
My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die now!
Then there's The Usual Suspects, a very different kind of bedtime story, but one that functions very much the same way. In it, Kevin Spacey's character Verbal Kent is the lone survivor of a massacre at a pier, and the police, led by Chaz Palminteri's Agent Kuyan, bring him in for questioning. The entire movie, then, is the story of Kent's interrogation, framing the second story, which follows how Kent comes to meet the ragtag group of doomed criminals.
Keys, what the f?
The way King uses the frame story technique in the Jaunt is simple and effective. It's traditional, and hey, tradition is only tradition because it works. In our main story, Story A, we have Ricky and Patricia, Mark's two kids, curious about jaunting. Kids being kids, they love asking questions, and hey, Mark knows all about jaunting. Its creation, its methods, the government's development of it, and all the dark rumors surrounding it. In a frame story, it always helps to have at least one character telling the story and one character receiving the story, and it's even more helpful if the receiver is hungry for the story. Grandson Fred Savage in The Princess Bride, or hungry for the information contained within that story, Special Agent Chaz Palminteri in The Usual Suspects. And when the storyteller loves to spin a yarn, Grandpa Peter Falk in The Princess Bride, or is forced to cough up the info, Suspect Kevin Spacey in The Usual Suspects, it keeps the story's momentum moving forward.
And like that, he's gone.
This being Stephen King, we know deep in our bones that this miracle of science, the teleportation of human beings across the vast expanse of space, will have a dark side. And it's not long before Victor Carroon discovers there's a big difference between teleporting inanimate objects and conscious animals, in this case mice. Mouse after mouse starts at jaunt point A, very much alive, and ends up milliseconds later at jaunt point B, very much not alive. And Carroon has to lose a lot of mice before realizing that they can only safely make the jaunt if they're unconscious. Jaunting a conscious being, especially a person, can lead to some disastrous results. It seems to revolve around the idea of consciousness and the fact that consciousness doesn't particulate. It remains whole and constant. It also retains some screwy sense of time. But we don't know how pure consciousness would measure time, or even if that concept has any meaning to pure mind. We can't even conceive what pure mind might be. Mark fell silent, troubled by his son's eyes, which were suddenly so sharp and curious. He understands, but he doesn't understand, Mark thought. Your mind can be your best friend. It can keep you amused, even when there's nothing to read, nothing to do, but it can turn on you when it's left with no input for too long. It can turn on you, which means that it turns on itself, savages itself, perhaps consumes itself in an unthinkable act of auto-cannibalism. How long in there, in terms of years? 0.0000000000067 seconds for the body to jaunt, but how long for the unparticulated consciousness? 100 years? 1,000? 1,000,000? 1,000,000,000? How long alone with your thoughts in an endless field of white? And then, when 1,000,000,000 eternities have passed, the crashing return of light and form and body. Who wouldn't go insane? You know what else can make you go insane? Trying to even define consciousness. Philosopher Sam Harris observes the slippery nature of consciousness. The state of being utterly confused about the nature of consciousness is itself a demonstration of consciousness. He goes on to say that whatever else consciousness may or may not be in physical terms, the difference between it and unconsciousness is first and foremost a matter of subjective experience. Either the lights are on, or they are not. This is what philosopher René Descartes was getting at with his famous principle, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And in the Jaunt, King is taking this idea to its nightmarish conclusion. What if your body, your corporeal form, ages mere milliseconds while your mind ages an eternity? Insanity might be the least of your problems. Those dead mice might have gotten off easy.
Gus.
With all this at stake then, why risk jaunting? Well, thankfully scientists have solved this pesky consciousness problem. All the jaunter needs is some gas to knock him out so that he's unconscious during the jaunt. But still, why Mars? Are Mark and his family jaunting to Mars just because Arnold told them to?
Get your ass to Mars. Get your ass to Mars.
Water. Water is why our protagonist, Mark Oates and his family, are traveling to Mars for a 2-year business trip. You see, Mark works for Texaco Water. That's Texaco Oil to you and me here in the 21st century. Texaco became Texaco Oil Water, and Mobil had become Mobil Hydro 2 Ox. By 2045, water prospecting became the big game, and oil had become what it had been in 1906, a toy. Remember, the water shortage aspect of the jaunt is what aforementioned Omni magazine editorial director Ben Bova contributed to King's story. And in a science fiction horror story about losing your mind to the howling madness of eternity, well, Humanity running out of water is the scariest thing in it, because it's true. A 2023 United Nations report rang the alarm. 2 billion people, that's 26% of the population, do not have safe drinking water, and 3.6 billion, that's 46% of the population, lack access to safely managed sanitation. It went on to say that between 2 and 3 billion people experience water shortages for at least 1 month per year, posing severe risks to livelihoods, notably through food security and access to electricity. The global urban population facing water scarcity is projected to double from 930 million in 2016 to 1.7 to 2.4 billion people in 2050. The growing incidence of extreme and prolonged droughts is also stressing ecosystems with dire consequences for both plant and animal species. Scary stuff. And it's also scary how spot on King was back when he wrote the Jaunt in the early 80s. As Mark explains to his kids, there's enough oil on Mars to last almost 8,000 years, and enough on Venus to last another 20,000. But oil isn't even that important anymore. Now, what we need most of all is water, Patty cried, and the businessman looked up from his papers and smiled at her for a moment. That's right, Mark said, because in the years between 1960 and 2030, we poisoned most of ours. The first water lift from the Martian ice caps was called Operation Straw. That was Ricky. Yes, 2045 or thereabouts, but long before that, the Jaunt was being used to find sources of clean water here on Earth, and now water is our major Martian export. The oil's strictly a sideline.
As early as 2025, experts say that half the world's population will be living in places where there isn't enough water. And it's estimated that by 2040, most of the world won't have enough water to keep up with demand all year long. Climate change is also melting ice caps and glaciers, which is reducing the world's supply of fresh water. NASA estimates that 7 areas across the globe are losing nearly 300 billion tons of ice every year. Experts say that if our depletion, pollution, and misuse of fresh water continues unchecked, it could affect not only our entire food system, but also push ecosystems and societies to a point of no return.
With Mark's tale of Victor Caroon and jaunting coming to an end, the Jaunt attendant finally reaches him and his family. Only moments away from their jaunt to Mars, the attendant preps the gas, ready to send Mark and his family to the dark abyss of unconsciousness. The jaunt attendant looked at him questioningly. Mark nodded and made a smile. The mask descended. Mark took it in his own hands and breathed deep of the dark. The first thing he became aware of was the hard black Martian sky as seen through the top of the dome which surrounded Whitehead City. It was night here, and the stars sprawled with a fiery brilliance undreamed of on Earth. The second thing he became aware of was some sort of disturbance in the recovery room. Mutters, then shouts, then a shrill scream. Oh dear God, that's Marilis, he thought, and struggled up from his jaunt couch, fighting the waves of dizziness. There was another scream, and he saw jaunt attendants running toward their couches, their bright red jumpers flying around their knees. Marilis staggered toward him, pointing. She screamed again and then collapsed on the floor, sending an unoccupied jaunt couch rolling slowly down the aisle with one weakly clutching hand. But Mark had already followed the direction of her pointing finger. He had seen. It hadn't been fright in Ricky's eyes. It had been excitement. He should have known, because he knew Ricky who had fallen out of the highest crotch of the tree in their backyard in Schenectady when he was only 7, who had broken his arm and was lucky that had been all he'd broken. Ricky, who dared to go faster and further on his slide board than any other kid in the neighborhood. Ricky, who was first to take any dare. Ricky and fear were not well acquainted. Until now. Beside Ricky, his sister still mercifully slept. The thing that had been his son bounced and writhed on its jaunt couch, a 12-year-old boy with a snow-white fall of hair and eyes which were incredibly ancient, the corneas gone a sickly yellow. Here was a creature older than time, masquerading as a boy, and yet it bounced and writhed with the kind of horrid, obscene glee, and at its choked, lunatic cackles, the jaunt attendants drew back in terror. Some of them fled, although they had been trained to cope with just such an unthinkable eventuality. The old young legs twitched and quivered. Claw hands beat and twisted and danced on the air. Abruptly, they descended, and the thing that had been his son began to claw at its face. "Longer than you think, Dad," it cackled. "Longer than you think. Held my breath when they gave me the gas. Wanted to see. I saw. Longer than you think." Cackling and screeching, the thing on the Jaunt couch suddenly clawed its own eyes out. Blood gouted. The recovery room was an aviary of screaming voices now. "Longer than you think, Dad! I saw! Long Jaunt! Longer than you think!" It said other things before the Jaunt attendants were finally able to bear it away, rolling its couch swiftly away as it screamed and clawed at the eyes that had seen the unseeable forever and ever. It said other things, and then it began to scream, but Mark Oates didn't hear it, because by then, he was screaming himself. Chilling. Stephen King loves to dabble in all sorts of different genres, but even when he dips his toe into the science fiction pool, he just can't help himself from injecting some pitch black horror into it.
Barbershop, how may I help you?
Hi, yes, I'd like to make an appointment for a haircut. I'm looking to get it quite a bit shorter. How long is it? It's longer than you think. Longer than you think! If you like what we're doing over here at the Stephen Kingdom and would like to show us a little monetary love, our Patreon has all sorts of exclusive goodies for our supporters, including extended and deleted scenes, behind-the-scenes featurettes, early access to episodes, and your name in the end credits. Be sure to subscribe to the Stephen Kingdom channel here, and check out our past short story episodes here. Long days and pleasant nights, Constant Watchers.